Hi guys, it's Jess from Honest Fiction, and welcome back to my channel. Today I'll be sharing my September wrap-up. Alright guys, so September was an amazing reading month for me. I read a little over 20 books, and I have a really good mix of fantasy romance, and romance. I really got back into fantasy in September, and I'm so happy I did because I read some absolutely amazing reads that I'm so excited to talk about. So I will be doing this by genre, like all my other wrap-ups, and if you're unfamiliar with my channel, I post new videos every Thursday and Sunday. If you haven't yet, please like and subscribe. You can also hit the notification bell to be notified whenever I post new bookish content. You can also check out my Instagram and Goodreads, both linked down below. With all that out of the way, let's talk about the books I read in September. Alright guys, so I'm going to change it up a little bit. I'm going to do adult fantasy before YA fantasy. So first up we have Spells for Forgetting by Adrienne Young. So I actually vlogged my experience reading this book, and that vlog should be up next week. I have very mixed feelings about it. So this story is following a group of people living on the island of Sersha. And Sersha is very rooted in like dark magic, or just like magic in general. So most of the women that are living on this island practice some sort of witchcraft, and they pass it on to their children. And really, once you live on this island, you never leave. And there are tourists that like come to the island, but for the most part, it's just a very tight-knit community. So it's a multi-POV story, but we're mainly following Emery and August, and they are part of this like 4-person femme group that's comprised of Emery, August, Dutch, and I think Lily is the other girl. And they all grow up together, and Emery and August form a relationship, and they eventually want to leave the island, which I said is very unheard of. So they decide they're going to leave, but the day before they are set to leave, Lily dies, a mysterious death, and the entire community blames August. So there's not enough evidence to actually convict him, but August and his mother are pretty much run off of this island, and he grows up just separated from everybody. So then I think like 10 years goes by, and August's mother unfortunately dies, and in her will she says that she wants to be buried on Sersha. So even though he knows he's really hated, August goes back to Sersha. When he gets there, he meets Emery, and the book is pretty much trying to figure out what actually happened the night of Lily's murder. So I like this. I thought it was good. It just felt very much like a murder mystery that just happened to have some like witchy magic elements involved. I wanted more of that like fall ambiance and vibes, and I really didn't get that. So that was like my one critique of this book. I just wish the witchiness was a little bit more consistent throughout. But overall, it was a really fun story, and I think if you want a really good murder mystery, I would check this out. Moving on, the next few books I'm about to talk about, I actually have already talked about in other videos, so I'm going to keep my thoughts on them pretty brief. First up, we have The Undertaking of Hart and Mercy, and I have pitched this as if Hayao Miyazaki was tasked with doing his own like reimagining of You've Got Mail, and he had to throw in zombies. It is a fantasy romance rom-com. It is super unique. I did enjoy it. It is following Mercy, and she is this woman that is working in her father's undertaking business. So her job is to embalm bodies, and that is where she meets Hart. Hart is a marshal who is responsible for killing dregs, which are zombies, essentially. They are these corpses that have been reanimated, and the only way to kill them is to shoot them in the appendix. I don't know why that is. So Hart is also a demigod, so he's kind of an outcast of society, and Hart and Mercy hate each other because of some miscommunication in the very beginning of the story. Unfortunately, they have to interact pretty often because Hart brings all of the dead dregs to Mercy. So one day after getting into a big fight, Hart leaves, and he pens this letter just saying to a friend, and it's talking about how lonely he is, and just like he just needs someone to talk to. Now, he doesn't think this letter is going to go to anybody, but the letter is delivered by, I think it's a giant owl or a giant rabbit. There are like crazy creatures in this book, to Mercy, and she reads it, and she's like, oh my gosh, I completely relate to this, and she writes her own letter, and they don't realize that they are talking to each other, and it's a very cute story. I really enjoyed this. I wish there was a little bit more fantasy. I feel like the first half of this was very much just the rom-com, and then we got a little bit of fantasy, like action at the end. But overall, I think this is a really good book, and definitely perfect for like the spooky fall season. And next up, I read Nettle and Bone, and this is like a dark fairy tale. We are following our main character, I think her name is Mara, and all of her older sisters have been wed to this king who is very abusive, and her oldest sister ends up dying. Shortly after her marriage, the second sister, she has lost contact with because she was sent to a convent as soon as her second sister wed. So we see Mara meeting up with her sister again, and she finds out that her sister is being abused by her husband, and she needs to figure out a way to get her sister out of this nightmare that is her life. So with the help of a witch and some other very interesting characters, she tries to find a way to get revenge on the king. And this was fun. I mean, it was dark. It was definitely dark. The beginning was way darker than I was expecting. Check trigger warnings, especially for like domestic violence. But the story of like our main character coming out of her shell and like really finding herself and finding her inner strength, and just the characters. There's a demon chicken. I love that demon chicken. He is my favorite character by far. But yeah, it was just a really cool story, and I really enjoyed it, and I'm so happy I read it. So definitely if you want a fantasy that kind of has those like fairy tale like vibes, I would check out Nettle and Bone. Alright guys, moving into YA fantasy. I only have one book for YA fantasy, but it's amazing, and I feel like I've talked about it in almost every single video I've recorded for September. That is Belladonna by Adalyn Grace. This is a gothic YA mystery fantasy, and it is just, it's so good. We are following Signa, and when Signa is an infant or a baby, her mother ends up taking her to this party, and while Signa is sleeping in her crib, the entire party ends up dying. So death shows up in corporeal form and starts harboring all of the souls of the deceased to the afterlife, but when he reaches for Signa's soul, he realizes he can't take her with him. So he is very intrigued and ends up following Signa while she is growing up, which ends up being a little bit of a disservice to Signa because everyone who is entrusted to care for her ends up dying mysteriously at a pretty early age. So the entire town thinks that Signa is cursed, and she eventually is entrusted to live with these distant relatives who she's never met. And when she gets there, she finds out that the mother had recently died, and now the daughter is very sick. So Signa is trying to find or solve the mystery of what is making this daughter sick, and it's so good. It just has a little bit of everything. You have the gothic, creepy factor. There's some ghosts in this, and it's so good, and it has all of the fall feels. There's also a romance that I was not expecting to be so into, but I really was. It's so fun. So this is the Fairy Loot edition, and I'm actually going to take off the dust jacket because I love the naked hardback. So look how pretty that is. And then it has like, I don't know if my camera is going to focus. We have like leaves, super pretty, and then the artwork is also absolutely stunning. Fairy Loot really did a great job with this one. And then, so yeah, this was probably one of my absolute favorite reads of September, and I highly, highly recommend. All right, so moving into fantasy romance. I only read one duet, and it is dark fantasy romance. So check all of the trigger warnings before you start this. This book was a time. So the duet is the Pale Court Duet. So the first book is King of Flesh and Bone. The second book is Queen of Rot and Pain. And I was actually gifted this by Victoria from Victoria's Romance Reads. So thank you so much for that. I was so excited to get a copy. So this book, this duet, it's something. So we are following Ada, and Ada lives in a world where when people pass away, their bodies don't rot. Instead, they reanimate and just kind of wander around. So, and they also will attack whoever is like near them. So this is all happening because of the King of Flesh and Bone, and we really don't know who that is or why he's doing this. We just know that he kind of disappeared from the lands. So one day Ada's out, and she ends up being dragged by one of these deceased animals, and she gets caught on the animal's like rear or something, and he ends up dragging her into the King of Flesh and Bone's realm, which she shouldn't be able to get into because she's alive. Now the King of Flesh and Bone is a kinky MF, and he's like, ooh, human, you're gonna be my plaything, and I don't care that you are a human and not an animal, and I'm just gonna do whatever I want with you. So there is like kind of non-con in this. Also at one point, in the very beginning, she's like trying to escape, and he just breaks her legs, and he keeps saying, I didn't break them, I twisted them, and she's like, same thing, dude. So it was something. This is one of the heroes that he never really turns good. It's more of like you understanding his actions, but still like he never feels bad about what he did. Ever. Like he's still to the end of the duet is like, yeah, well you tried to leave, so I twisted your legs. So just know that going in. This hero is never going to be, he's not a redeemable hero, really. So anyway, she ends up being kind of like his servant, and she's living in like the Hades like type realm. And then things start to happen, and eventually they end up forming a like real relationship, and it's their relationship as they're trying to figure out what to do about the humans and these rotting bodies, and it's a time. It's something super spicy. I will give it that. I still am not sure how I really feel about this duet, but it's like nothing I've ever read before. So that's that. So if you want a really dark fantasy romance, I would check this out. Just like I said, check all of the trigger warnings. Moving into paranormal romance, this next book, 5-star read. I'm obsessed with it. It was so good, and that is Wolfsong by T.J Klune. So this is an shifter romance, and I don't typically love werewolf romances, Team Edward all the way, and just sometimes, I don't know, werewolf romances just feel a little bit cringy, but this book was beautiful. So we are following Ox, and when the story starts, Ox's father has just left his family, and Ox is considered simple to like most of the community. He doesn't talk very much, he's very direct, but he has an amazing heart, and he really cares about his mother, and then Gordo, who's like his father figure, and the shop that he works in. He works in this garage that Gordo owns with like some of Gordo's friends. So one day when he's walking home from the shop, I think he's like 16 years old, he sees this 10-year-old boy that just won't stop talking, and they immediately become very close friends. The 10-year-old boy takes him home to meet his family, the family seems a little strange, but also Ox feels immediately just welcome. It really has that found family trope. And then we find out that the 10-year-old boy is actually a werewolf, and he is going to be the next alpha of the werewolf pack. And that's pretty much all I'm going to say about this, but this book, it was so, so good. So this is the same author that wrote House in the Cerulean Sea, and he has a very unique writing style, so I can see how some people probably wouldn't be a fan of it. This is very slow paced. When I first jumped into this book, I thought I might DNF it. It was very slow, but I think that was completely necessary to make you fall in love with these characters. You are just wanting them to be together, and the chemistry and the angst is just so, so good. So, highly recommend. By far, my favorite werewolf romance, and definitely give it a try. And I was so excited talking about this book that I forgot to say thank you to Cheyenne, that tall book girl. She gifted me this for my birthday, and I was so excited. So I actually added this to my wish list, I think like 3 days before my birthday. And I told my husband if that book was still on there, could he please buy it? It was a book I really, really wanted. And the next day, it was gone. So thank you so much, Cheyenne. I was so excited when I received this. And next up for paranormal romance, we have The Dead Romantics, and this is by Ashley Poston. So this is following Florence, and she's a ghostwriter who can actually see ghosts. And she's been writing for a romance author for a while, but after a really devastating breakup, she just cannot write the last book of this romance series. So her editor ends up pressuring her and says, hey, you really have to get this done. He's this very attractive, handsome new editor, and right away she's like, oh my god, I am so not gonna be able to do this. So then right after that meeting, her father ends up passing away, and she goes to her hometown to try and help plan his funeral. And when she gets there, there's a ghost kind of waiting for her, and it happens to be someone we met earlier in the book, and it's their romance. So I really did enjoy this. However, no going into this, this is very much about parental loss. This is dealing with the grief of losing a parent, and that's a lot of what this book is. It feels like from the cover that it should be very rom-com-y, and yes, there are funny moments, but this book is actually pretty deep. It's very emotional, so just know that going into it, but overall, this was a really good read, and I look forward to reading more from this author. So moving into dark romance. First up, I finished the Off Balance series by Lucia Franco. So I've talked about this series a lot on my channel. It's really popular right now. So this is a series that follows Rhea, who is this young girl that wants to become an Olympic gymnast. So her father ends up sending her across country to train with Kova, who's like one of the greatest gymnasts. And they end up having a relationship, and it's super angsty, very taboo, super toxic, but such a good read. So Twist was by far my favorite in this series. That book is just so good. And then Dismount was also really enjoyable. I read both of these books on my family vacation, and I literally hid out and just read the entire time. Like, I was addicted to those last two books. So Out of Bounds recently came out, which is kind of like a another book that it's not part of the series, but it's a companion novel to the series. And I'm very excited to read that. I'll be reading that in October. But overall, highly recommend. Just check trigger warnings. It is a decent age gap, but it's so good. And the next 3 books on this list are Mafia romances. So first up we have Mafia Madman, and this was gifted to me by Christy from Christy Reads a Lot, so thank you so much. This is my favorite in the Kings of Italy series. So this is following Enzo, who's kind of like the bad guy from Mafia Madman and Mafia Darling, and Gia. So when this starts off, Enzo has been living on a yacht, completely isolated, just plotting his revenge on Fausto. So one day he goes to Italy on a rare occasion, and he's meeting with this designer, and one of the models is Gia, and he realizes he can kidnap Gia and use her against Fausto because Gia is technically Fausto's sister-in-law. So when Gia is taken to the yacht, Fausto realizes right away Gia is not going to make a good prisoner, and it's really just their power struggle, and it's so good, and I loved it. So if you want a really good like captor-captive trope, I would definitely check this out. And next up, I read Sweet Temptation by Cora Reilly. So this is following Cassio, and when the story starts, he is part of the Mafia. He is currently trying to expand his territory into Philadelphia, and his wife passes away. So his entire family is like, you need a wife to take care of your kids because we're men and we don't do that. So he ends up striking an agreement with Julia's father. Now Julia is this sweet, innocent, bubbly 16-year-old girl who doesn't really love the Mafia life, but she's gonna do what she has to do. So on her 18th birthday, she marries Cassio, and this is very grumpy sunshine, but I really enjoyed it. This is kind of like Mafia romance light. Like, there are spicy scenes, there are some darker elements, but for the most part, it's really just seeing Julia make Cassio a better person, and it was adorable, and I really enjoyed it. I think I read this in one sitting. So highly recommend. Definitely if you're like new to Mafia romance, I think this is a good starter. Next up is one of my new all-time favorite age gap Mafia romances, and that is Little Dove by Layla Frost. So when the story starts, we are seeing Juliet, and her father is a MMA fighter, but he's also a gambler, and he's just a pretty terrible person. So Juliet, I think, is 16 when the book starts, and she's like scrounging for food in her pantry, and then she hears a loud bang. So she goes and hides, and her father ends up being killed by Maximo. So when Julia runs out of the closet to try to escape, Maximo ends up kidnapping her. And instead of killing her, like she thinks is about to happen, he takes her to his mansion, where he takes very good care of her, gets her an education, buys her everything she wants, and she lives a life in luxury. And then once she turns 18, Maximo has an offer for her and says that he's really into the daddy praise kink and would she be his submissive? And she's like, all right, let's do this. So it goes from there. I love this so much, and I am someone who actually hates the whole daddy kink. It was never a thing for me, but it works in this book. I love their relationship. It was so good, and it had like the perfect amount of spice, but also plot and also action, and this is just a really good read. So highly recommend if you love Mafia romance with an age gap and a praise kink, check this out. And next up, I read The Truth About Heartbreak by B. Celeste. So this is a brother's best friend age gap, kind of also has cheating, so check trigger warnings romance. And we are following River. So in the beginning of the story, she is very young and she's been horribly abused by her parents, so she's in the foster care system. And she ends up being adopted by this very lovely family and becomes very close with her very protective stepbrother and his best friend Everett. So right away, River has a huge crush on Everett, but it's not really reciprocated until she is in high school. And then something happens one night. Unfortunately, Everett has a girlfriend, and this ends up being a long-time girlfriend. So we're kind of starting the book where that event I just mentioned happened, and then looking back on the past, and then seeing how it's going to affect their future. So overall, I like this. I'm not crazy about reading about cheating, and I think it wasn't handled super well in this, but it was an enjoyable story, and I liked it enough to read the second book in the series. So then I read The Truth About Tomorrow, which is the second book in this series. And it was something. So we are following Ollie and Charlie. Ollie, or Oliver, is actually the brother of River from the first book. And he ends up having a relationship with River's adopted daughter. So this is kind of like an uncle romance. And it felt kind of weird because it starts where where our main character, Charlie, is super young. I think she's like 11 and she has a crush on her really cool uncle. And then like as she grows up, I think she ends up going to college where he's living. She ends up staying with him, and they end up being found in like a very compromising situation. So then they end up taking a break. It felt kind of weird. I don't know how I felt about it. I felt similarly to how I felt about Torn by Carrie and Cole. It's just anytime the character is looking back on like teaching a child how to ride a bike or like doing these like cute childhood moments, but then the next scene is them like sleeping together, it weirds me out. I'm just not cool with it. So I didn't love this one. I don't regret reading it. It was a time. But yeah, not my favorite age gap romance. And last up for dark romance, I read Sunshine and Bullets by Coralee June. So this is a reverse harem romantic suspense series, and we're following this girl that has a close relationship with these three like bad boy type guys in high school. And one of them's from like a mafia family, another one's like a fighter, and they're just like the really cool bad guys in the school. And they all really look out for our main character. So she has a crush on all of them, but they've never done anything intimate. And then she's also really close with her father's friend who is a cop, but he's like close to her age. I think he's like new to being a police officer. And they're all like friends. So then one night something happens and she flees and cuts off all contact with these guys. And they're very concerned. They don't know what happened. So I think like 8 years goes by and they end up finding her and bringing her back. And we find out what happened that night. So I will say the reasoning is a little bit ridiculous, but overall I did like the series. I am very excited to continue with it. I put it down because I had a couple other books I wanted to read, but I will definitely be picking it back up. But overall, very fun reverse harem romantic suspense. And last up for rom-com, I read The Love Hypothesis by Allie Hazelwood. This is the second book in her STEM collection, the first one being The Love Hypothesis. And I did enjoy this. We are following Bree, and she is just this very quirky girl. She has purple hair, a lot of piercings, and she's traveled all over the world. And she works for NASA, and she's so excited when she finds out she is going to be heading this new project until she finds out she's actually going to be co-heading it with her college nemesis, Levi. And it is their story, and I did enjoy it. It was just felt a little bit like The Love Hypothesis 2.0. I did like the fact that these characters are aged up a little bit from The Love Hypothesis. Like both of these adults are working for NASA. They're out of college, and the steamy scenes were great. I just wish it was a little bit more different or stood out a little bit more from The Love Hypothesis, but still super fun read. I love reading about women in STEM, and it was just really fun. So highly recommend. If you liked The Love Hypothesis, you will definitely enjoy this. Alright guys, those are all the books I read in September. Thank you so much for watching, and please let me know if you have read any of the books I mentioned. Now, I said this already, I post new videos every Thursday and Sunday, and if you haven't yet, please like and subscribe. I will see you all next week. Bye!